Thank you, Eleanor. Hi, everyone. I really like the structure of this because what I can do now is to thread one person's story through this great sweep of history that has so brilliantly been laid out before us already this evening. The part of history that I want to speak into is that which has just been beautifully laid out by Stephen, which is Malta during World War II. And for that purpose, I'd like to introduce you to this man. This is David Hill, Captain David Hill at this point, of the Royal Artillery. This is the most inspirational figure in my life. And I wrote Everyone Brave is Forgiven because of conversations I'd had with this man. He was very funny. When he talked about the Second World War, it wasn't to tell us horror stories about it when we were young people growing up. For example, of his first parachute jump, he said, in the back of the plane we were all very scared, but then the sergeant major cheered us up by saying, well, never mind, lads, if your parachutes don't open, you can just take them back to the packing shed. That was a typical war story from my granddad. Later, I began to have serious conversations with him about the war, of which the most extraordinary part was in Malta for him. This is the woman he was engaged to. This is Mary West, my maternal grandmother. She had been engaged to someone before my grandfather. He was killed by a bomb at the beginning of the Blitz, right at the very start. Next to her, in a cinema, about the size of this room. And she woke up in hospital, having lost a lot of blood, and she discovered two things in quick succession. The first was that the man she'd been engaged to be married to had been killed. The second thing she discovered was that the man she'd been engaged to be married to had already been married, which was news to her. He was a bigamist, and people weren't planning to die. And so they'd left all of these loose ends, and all of these secrets were revealed. My grandmother decided very quickly to get on with her life, and she said in her own words, to marry the next man with a pulse who crosses my path. And if she referred to that bomb in the cinema ever afterwards as a near miss. The person she met was my grandfather. They had met only 8 times before my grandfather learned that he was going to be deployed to the front. He did not know yet where to. But all he knew it was going to happen the next day, so he asked her if she would like to marry him, and she gave him a very frosty look, apparently, made him sweat and think about it for a little while, and then said, "Oh, David, what a simply marvellous idea. Thank you very much, I should love to." And that's it, they were engaged, but they didn't see each other again for 3.5 years. So my grandfather was put onto a troop ship, destined, as it turned out, for Malta. They communicated by letter. Here are 1,000 pages of letters written between my grandparents during the war. These are the things that I read and made me fascinated by the conditions on Malta, about which I had known very little before I embarked on the project. A lot of the letters are telegrams like this, and then later, as it became less and less possible to send telegrams as the siege really bit, they're these things, air letters. They were allowed 1 per person per week, and they would fold and fold and fold, and these. You've all seen these letters that they would write one way and then they would write the other way, so you could get 4 sides of writing onto 1 sheet of paper. And this is what they looked like. This is how they communicated. And this is how I know everything that I know about what they went through during the siege. Stephen's already beautifully explained the strategic importance of Malta during the Second World War, so I'll skip this. And move straight to the point where my grandfather arrives. He's been very seasick during the crossing. He wrote in January 1941, when he was just sailing through the Atlantic, he'd just recovered from horrible seasickness, and for the first time he'd regained the will to live, and had decided to have a bath on this troop ship. And he wrote to her, "How nice it is to lie in a bath and to have the water sluice around one without any encouragement. Nearly everything is damnable until you get used to it, and then it's quite pleasant." That was my grandfather's attitude to life in general, and it very nearly became the title of the novel, if only the jackets of books were wide enough. Nearly everything is damnable until you get used to it. And that was him. Then he arrives in Malta to a misty view, somewhat like this, and he writes to my grandmother, "I've seen the things that everyone sees when they travel south, in the way of dolphins, flying fish and sharks. And it's no use trying to be blasé about it all, because I've been thrilled. It was a grand moment today when we sighted Malta, a hazy, improbable outline in the mist that gradually became clearer until we could see delightful beaches and cliffs and the hills behind. Once it became clear, it was just like a Technicolor film. And this evening, to see lights on the land, bobbing up and down on the water, is totally unreal and very refreshing. Oh, and speaking of refreshment, would it be too cruel, darling, to tell you how we sat and ate oranges, with the sweet juice trickling down our faces? It's rather hard that you'll probably read this with the March wind whistling through the cracking in the floor of your room. But that's how things are. I'm seeing the world and enjoying it, but I'm thinking all the time how much more marvellous it would be if only we were seeing it together." That's my grandfather. Then they arrived, and my grandfather was put in charge of the unit. He was in Royal Artillery. They had one main job, which was to defend Grand Harbour from attack by air, so that the convoys, which was so hard fought through to Malta, which Stephen has brilliantly described, could be patched up and could set out to sea again. In order to do that, it was necessary to set up air cover over Malta, and specifically over Grand Harbour, and that's what my grandfather was involved in doing. But he found, when he arrived, his particular unit not in a particularly good state. The first thing they had to do was camouflage and paint everything. This is what an enormous amount of Malta looked like and still does. It's limestone and largely in blocks. And so the first thing they had to do was to paint absolutely everything they had to look like rocks. This is called rubble painting. And this is what my grandfather spent about a month showing people and telling people what to do. Here are some more rocks. Here are some more things designed to look like rocks. Here are more rocks. So my grandfather said that he saw rubble in his sleep. He saw the outlines of rubble painting on the faces of the men he was looking at. He was starting to hallucinate rubble painting. It was on everything. These are his anti-aircraft guns. The next thing they had to do was to install all of these weapons appropriately. So one of the amazing things about artillery is that it leaves a very lasting trace on the ground. So I was able to sit with my grandfather and, using Google Earth, look at the places that he'd told me about and that he'd written about in his memoir of the war. And we could actually find the exact places where he'd been stationed and where he had installed batteries. So you could zoom in, and if you look in the center of this image, you can zoom in, and you can zoom in, and you can see this very characteristic trace that survives to this day, because if there's one thing you can't shift, it's a 500-ton chunk of poured concrete, which is what they set up their guns on. But they also had a lot of time in between the air raids for relaxation. This is one of the details that really moved me, is how hard they worked to keep up everyone's morale. They built sailing dinghies, and they raced sailing dinghies in the little creeks and inlets and harbours around the east coast of the island. And in order to have a course to sail around, they used the floating mines that defended the island. So the upwind mark would have been this horrible spiky mark. And so I don't know if you've ever raced dinghies. It's technically useful to get as close as you can to the marks. But obviously it added another element to the sport. Things then took a turn. Things became a lot more serious. And Stephen's already talked a lot about how desperate the bombing was. This is Valletta in really quite early stages of the bombing. It got flatter than this. My grandfather told a heartbreaking detail as the siege began to really gain strength, as the blockade began to bite, as they had less and less to eat. His positions were always surrounded by dogs which used to bark and bark and bark in the aftermath of every raid. But he said the most haunting thing was that as the siege wore on, there were fewer and fewer dogs barking. And it was because they either hadn't been fed or people had actually had to eat them. He said that by the middle stage of the siege, people were so hungry that their military uniforms were several sizes too big for them. And he said the impression it gave was that of schoolboys dressed up to play war. Because there was no way to shrink the uniform, but the people shrank. This is Fort Bengemma on the Victoria Lines in the northern third of Malta. This is a fort where my grandfather was stationed. They used to rotate people out of Valletta and up onto the lines. It was a quieter place to give them a week or two out. Here, they really concentrated on how hungry they were. This is the view from the rampart of Fort Bengemma. My grandfather described this to me in perfect detail, and it corresponded to the photos I could take when I was there. Every single terrace of this fort was observed by Royal Artillery spotters from the ramparts of the fort, where they would look at every single individual pear and strawberry that was growing with high-powered spotters' binoculars and catalogue it in the military system and assign it sometimes a name, and if it was a particularly appealing pear, they would give it a military rank. And watch it being up. That's how hungry they were. They were obsessed with food. This is the moat of Fort Bengemma. It's overgrown now, but in this moat, my grandfather and his men planted seed potatoes and tried to grow a crop. They succeeded. They also raised pigs in the moat. When those were ready, they didn't just snaffle them themselves as the garrison of that fort. They put them into the collective ration of the island, and a lot of you will be familiar with these victory kitchens, where that food was put into a communal ration and made into soups and stews and distributed in these long queues that formed. Most of the work that my grandfather was doing was defending Grand Harbour. Here it is. He was also involved in hosting naval officers who had come off the convoys, having suffered extraordinary trauma because the attrition rate on the convoys was so unbelievably high, and people just stepped off these unbelievably damaged ships onto solid ground, and at that point fell apart, right? Having been rock solid through the whole convoy, the transition to safety was almost unbearable for some of them. And so there was a huge psychological component to what the land-based garrison could do for the Navy when they arrived on these convoys. I'm going to finish by telling you how my grandfather got off Malta, because he left before the end of the siege, and he left because of this man who, in this photo, looks enormous. He's Randolph Churchill, the son of the Prime Minister. He was an extraordinary man. He had big shoes to fill, and in many ways was given an impossible role in life. It's a tough act to live up to. But he did his best, and he fancied himself as a bit of a commando, and he was given carte blanche, really, to set up commando units during the war, which he did. This is him. He was sent to Malta, with his commando suit fitting him, as my grandfather said, like a grocer's bag around a single onion. This was a group of people who had been starving for a very long time, and into that group Randolph Churchill was parachuted, and my grandfather was assigned to look after him, and he was given the following order: David, this is Randolph, look after him, and for God's sake, please make sure that nothing happens. Which is a delightfully ambiguous order, I think you'll agree. It wasn't entirely clear whose side Randolph was to be defended from. He wasn't very popular amongst the troops, who were all emaciated by this stage, and Randolph took to bathing quite extravagantly in front of them in a well-fed state, which wasn't very popular. And yet, what he was doing on the island was extraordinary. He was recruiting for fledgling units that would later become the SAS, and he was offering everyone on the island the following deal: I can get you off this island, I can get you out of this siege, if you'll sign up for these informal units that I'm creating in the desert. And having helped Randolph Churchill to shop that deal around the island for a few weeks, my grandfather thought it would be churlish not to take the deal himself. And so this is him ending up in one of these informal units in the North African desert, preparing forces for the invasion of Sicily. I think the best place to finish talking about my grandfather's story is to talk about the people who weren't as lucky as him. In Malta, you can visit some of the many military cemeteries, and they are haunting and they're moving, as all of these places are, but there's one peculiarity of the cemeteries on Malta. Now, I went around looking for the graves of my grandfather's friends who didn't make it, and it is very moving to see their names inscribed in stone. Something else that really jumps out at you is that this is different from any other military cemetery that you'll have seen, in that there are 6, sometimes 7 men in every grave. This is one stone covering them. And usually there's one headstone per fallen soldier. Here it's different, 6 to a grave. And I asked the caretaker of the cemetery why that was. And he said, well, you try digging a hole any way you like on this island. And it's true. It's 4 or 5 inches of topsoil above this hard yellow limestone. And that's really, I think, when the sadness of what had happened really came through to me in a different way, because the idea of being so hungry and so exhausted and so beaten down, and your tools being so blunt that you couldn't dig one hole for each of your fallen and dearly loved friends, is extremely sad. And it made me realise that when they gave the George Cross to Malta, it was because what they had been through, what the garrison had been through, what the convoys who had supplied relief to the garrison had been through, what the Maltese had been through, was extraordinary. And I think it's still very underappreciated and very little known in its brutal detail, what the island went through. It certainly changed the way I saw that part of the war, and I hope that you've found it interesting to see one person's journey into that siege and out of it again. Thank you.